Hey guys, hope you're having a awesome day. What I wanted to kind of talk to you about today is the beginning of the Westward Expansion movement. And we're going to kind of go through a lot, but I really just want to set the foundation for Westward Expansion. And the biggest thing that I want you to understand is that when we talk about things in social studies, a lot of times they overlap with one another. For example, it's not like Reconstruction ended and then Westward Expansion started. A lot of the things that we talk about today were going on at the same time during Reconstruction. So that's kind of what we're going to do today. Just get started on Westward Expansion and see what we can get. So something that's important to understand is during the Civil War and during Reconstruction, all of the railroads were on the East Coast. And so it was really difficult for people to get out west. So if they wanted to get out west, they had a couple of choices. Number one, they could use a stagecoach, which would be about a 3 to 4, 5, sometimes 6 month journey. And it was really, really dangerous to ride a stagecoach. There were a couple of reasons why it was dangerous. Number one, the geography. They had to cross rivers like the Mississippi River, the Colorado River, the Snake River. They had to cross rivers, and that was difficult in a stagecoach. And then they also had to deal with mountains. So sometimes they would have to, figure out ways to go through mountains or try to go around or over mountains. And so that was really, really difficult. So the stagecoach was a difficult way to get out west. The other option that they had is they could sail in a boat all the way around Central America. And that was a safe way of getting out west, but it took a really, really long time. And so those were kind of the two choices that they had to get out west. And so not very many people went out west. And when they did, when people did move out west, it was really difficult to get information to people who were living out west. Which takes us to our next topic, which was a way of getting information out west. What happened in the late 1800s is something was developed called the Pony Express. And what the Pony Express was, is it was like the first kind of mail system to get information to people out west. And it was a giant relay race. What they would do is people who worked for the Pony Express, they would ride their horse so many miles. They would pass the letters or the packages off to the next guy. He would ride his horse for so many miles. He would pass it to the next person, and he would ride his horse for so many miles. And so the Pony Express was like a big 2,000-mile long relay race. That's the best way to think about the Pony Express. And so that was a way of getting information to people who lived out west. For example, let's say we had a death in a family and we wanted our cousins or our aunts and uncles who moved out west to know about that. We could send a letter through the Pony Express and they could get that information in about 2 weeks. So after the Pony Express, we get an invention called the telegraph. And the telegraph is really important because what the telegraph did is it allowed us to get information out west in a matter of minutes. So what happened was Samuel Morse invented this telegraph, and the way the telegraph worked is you clicked on it and it would send these messages along wires. The best way to think about the telegraph is like the first modern day text message. So he invented the telegraph, and it would send these messages with beeps and dashes. And so you would get a message that sounded like beep, 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 something like that. And so he invented something else called Morse code that was named after him. And that was the code that they used to send those messages. And so the beeps and dashes stand for letters. And so when somebody received a message, instead of just hearing beeps and dashes, they could kind of use Morse code to figure out what the message was. And so the telegraph completely ended the Pony Express, because the telegraph could get messages across the country much, much quicker. And so there was no need to have this big, long relay race when we could put up telegraph wires, which looked a lot like power lines, and send a message in a matter of minutes on the telegraph. And so that was the quickest way up to this point to get information out west. You know, you think about today, we have email, phone calls, we can call somebody or send an email and they get that information immediately. That wasn't the case in the late 1800s. And so the telegraph became the quickest way to get information in a matter of minutes. So the Pony Express and the telegraph are were ways to get information to people out west, but it wasn't a really good way of getting actually people to move out west, or goods, or those kinds of things. And so what happened was Abraham Lincoln came up with this idea for a transcontinental railroad. And so the Transcontinental Railroad was supposed to be a railroad that would extend all the way across the country, and it would be a way for people to actually move out west. And if you look at this map on the background, the Transcontinental Railroad starts right here, because we had railroads all out here in the east like this. So it started right here, and you can follow the line, and it went all the way out west. And so the Transcontinental Railroad literally crossed the continent. And so it's going to be a way of getting people and goods, things out west. So building the Transcontinental Railroad fell on two companies. The first company was the Union Pacific Company. And the Union Pacific Company started right here in Omaha, and they built from east to west. And so they started in the east, and they built east to west. The second company was the Central Pacific Company. The Central Pacific Company started in Sacramento, and they built from west to east. And so what the point was, if you had the Central Pacific Company building this direction, and then you had the Union Pacific Company building this direction, the hope was for them to meet in the middle and build this Transcontinental Railroad. So it really came on these two companies, and each company is going to have their own set of problems. But what happened was the two companies started to race each other. They actually got paid by the amount of track that they laid, and so the Union Pacific Company knew if they could get further this way than the Central Pacific Company, or the Central Pacific Company knew if they could get further this way, that they could make more money building this Transcontinental Railroad. And so they actually started racing each other to see who could lay the most track. I show you this map so that you can see, again, the Union Pacific Company started about right here. So this is the Union Pacific Company. The Central Pacific Company started about right here. So this is the Central Pacific. Central Pacific went this way. The Union Pacific went from east to west. And so hopefully by looking at the geography here, you can see that the Union Pacific Company had an advantage right off the bat. They're in all of this flat land right here, whereas the Central Pacific Company had these mountains right here. Okay? And the biggest mountain range is actually this range right here that were called the Sierra Nevada Mountains. And so that's going to be one of the problems that they had to face. Another thing that I want you to notice while we're looking at this map is, if you are thinking about people who are moving out west in their stagecoach, right? First of all, you see the first problem is we have mountains right here. Okay? We have the big Mississippi River right here that they would have had to cross. We have all of these mountains that they would have had to cross. We have rivers here, here, and up here. And so the Mississippi, the Snake, the Colorado rivers. So those were some of the problems with geography that those people who were moving out west had to deal with. But if we get back to the railroad, what I want to talk to you about now is the fact that the Union Pacific Company and the Central Pacific Company had some problems. And this is just what I told you. Geography gave them an advantage. So let's talk about the problems that the two companies faced. The Union Pacific Company had two major problems, and those were finding enough workers, and they had problems with Native Americans. So let's start with finding enough workers. It was really difficult for the railroad company to find workers because, again, they were starting right here, and most of the cities were scattered over here on the East Coast. So the workers didn't live anywhere near the railroad. So it made it really, really difficult for them to find workers. The other thing is they didn't pay a whole lot of money. And then the last thing is most of the young men during this time period were fighting in this big war called the Civil War. Makes sense. So the Union Pacific Company really struggled to find enough people to come and lay down this track. Well, something happened in 1865. The Civil War ended, right? So when the Civil War ended, it kind of fixed the Union Pacific Company's problem, because what actually happened is thousands of Irish immigrant workers, and you need to know that they were Irish, who were fighting in the Union Army during the Civil War. Now they were out of a job. They decided to go work on the Union Pacific Railroad. So after the Civil War, the Irish immigrants, people who came from Ireland in our country and were fighting in the war, decided to go work for the Union Pacific, and so that solved their problem with workers. The second problem they had were Native Americans. When the Union Pacific Company laid their track right across the middle of the country, they were going straight through some Native American tribes, like the Lakota tribe and the Cheyenne tribe. And the biggest reason this was a problem is not just the fact that they were laying a railroad through the middle of their land, but it was also scaring away the buffalo. There were buffalo that were roaming in the middle of the country, and when the railroad company came through, it scared away all these buffalo. And you might remember from fourth grade, these Indian tribes that lived out in the Midwest of our country, they really relied heavily on the buffalo. And so the Native Americans did not like the Union Pacific Company laying tracks. So what did? They started to attack the workers. So how does the Union Pacific Company solve that problem? Well, if you remember General Sherman, from Sherman's march back into the Civil War, what Sherman does is he pretty much tells the Native Americans to get over it. He says, we're going to build this railroad whether you like it or not. And so he sends military troops out to protect the Union Pacific Company workers. And so they have guns, and they protect from these Native American attacks. So that's how we solve that problem. So the two problems that the Union Pacific Company had was finding enough workers and problems with Native Americans. Now let's talk about that was the Union Pacific. Now let's talk about the Central Pacific Company's problems. Their two problems are going to be those mountains that we talked about, and again, finding enough workers. So let's start with the mountains. When they went to lay the railroad, the mountains were the first thing that they came to. And so some surveyors had gone before them, and they found ways to kind of go around the mountains whenever possible, but it became really clear to them that they were going to have to go through the mountains. So how did they do that? They actually just used a lot of explosives. In fact, more explosives than were used in the Civil War combined. And so what they would do a lot of times is they would hang off the side of the mountain, they would stick the explosive in the wall, they would light it and then push off of the mountain when it exploded. And then once they got inside the mountain, they would lay these explosives and they would try to blow their way through the mountains. And they would also use a lot of hammers and chisels and those kind of things. And they just tried to work their way through the mountains. We're going to talk about it in just a second, but a lot of the employees for the Central Pacific Company were young teenage boys, and so there were lots and lots of accidents with these explosives trying to go through the mountains, and a lot of people, especially the young Chinese immigrants who worked, died in accidents trying to go through these mountains. So that's the first problem. The second problem is, again, workers. Both the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific Company had a problem getting workers. So the Union Pacific had the help from Irish immigrants. The Central Pacific Company is actually going to use the help of Chinese immigrants. The reason they had problems finding workers is most people who went out to California, where the Central Pacific Company started, they were looking for gold. And if you found gold, you became really, really rich. Well, if you worked on the railroad, you were not going to become really, really rich. So people who were given the choice would go look for gold instead of working on the railroad. So the Central Pacific Company found out that Chinese were willing to come and work for money, and it was cheaper to bring Chinese immigrants over on a boat than it was to try to get people across the country through those rivers and mountains that we talked about. And so thousands and thousands of Chinese immigrants came into our country to help the Central Pacific Company. In fact, so many Chinese people came in during this time that we're actually going to have to pass a law later called the Chinese Exclusion Act to stop Chinese immigrants from coming in. So the Chinese immigrants made up 80% of the Central Pacific Company's workforce. And like I mentioned before, many of them were teenagers. The other thing is they didn't speak English. And so you got to imagine the difficulty of young Chinese teenagers with explosives trying to go through mountains that don't speak English. Obviously, it was really difficult, but that's how they solved their problem. So Again, the Union Pacific used Irish immigrants. The Central Pacific used Chinese immigrants to solve their problem. So these two companies, they had their problems. They raced with one another. Once the Central Pacific got through those mountains, they sped up. And so this is one of my favorite quotes when it comes to the Transcontinental Railroad. Somebody said, we'll have the opportunity of bathing or swimming in the Atlantic Ocean one week and the Pacific Ocean the next. Again, the Transcontinental Railroad was meant to help people move out west. So let's talk about the end of the Transcontinental Railroad. You can see here in 1869, the Union Pacific and the Central Pacific companies meet. And they meet at a place called Promontory Point, which was in Utah. And it's kind of funny because when they meet, we're going to have this celebration that we're going to talk about in just a second. So the two companies, they finally meet with each other. Again, remember, I'm just going to kind of draw down here. The Union Pacific was moving this way. The Central Pacific was moving this way. And so they're going to meet right here in the middle. And that place was Promontory Point, Utah. Again, it took 7 years for them to complete this track. Another thing to remember is they weren't just laying one track. They were actually laying 2 tracks when they went so that a train could go both ways. So it could go this way on one track and it could come on the other track. So they meet at Promontory Point and they had this big celebration. And so the celebration was what we call the Golden Spike. They were gonna, when they laid down the railroad track, they had to drive these spikes in, these big nails. And so for the very last one, they actually used a golden spike. And it's a pretty funny story. Leland Stanford, who Stanford University was named after, he was the president of the Central Pacific Company. They give him the honor of nailing in the golden spike. So everybody's there. You can see in the background of this picture, this is at the golden spike ceremony. So he swings to hit the golden spike and he actually misses. And it's kind of funny. Everybody cheered anyway. But once they got it in, somebody sent the message done on the Telegraph, and the Transcontinental Railroad was officially finished. Now, the interesting thing about the Golden Spike ceremony is we just talked about Irish immigrants helped the Union Pacific Railroad. Chinese immigrants helped the Central Pacific Railroad. But neither one of those groups were allowed to attend this Golden Spike ceremony. So the two groups of people who essentially built the whole Transcontinental Railroad were not even allowed to come to this final ceremony. And so that's kind of the end of the Transcontinental Railroad. So why does it matter? Well, this is why it matters. Before the railroad, it would take months to travel across the country. You had people in stagecoaches trying to cross rivers and mountains, and it was difficult, and it cost a lot of money. Well, after the Transcontinental Railroad, you could get across the country in less than a week. And it costs much less. And so what we're going to see next is we're going to see lots and lots of people who begin to move out west. And so that's where we're going next. What was life like for these people who moved out west? But this kind of gives you the foundation of Westward Expansion. How we get information and how we start to get people and goods across the country. So, all right, hope you have an awesome day. I appreciate it.